This is Bill Tinglin with Tour for Tolerance, proud sponsor of this podcast series on the Holocaust. Get ready. This week we take another powerful deep dive into history's darkest hour.
All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today we're looking at something pretty heavy, but really important, I think.
Yeah.
The anti-Jewish laws and policies that were in Nazi Germany.
Right.
We've got this chapter from a history book, and it's really chilling, actually.
Yeah.
It's just a reminder of how these laws that can seem so simple on the surface can be used for hate.
Absolutely.
And how fast things can get out of control.
And what's so striking about this chapter is how systematic it was.
Yeah.
You know, the Nazis really used the law to take away the rights of Jewish people step by step.
Yeah.
It wasn't just violence, it was calculated.
Like they had a plan.
Exactly. A legalistic approach to discrimination, which is really frightening when you think about it.
So, if you can imagine for a second, living in Germany in 1933, right?
Right.
Hitler's just become the chancellor.
Yeah.
And almost immediately, overnight, the Nazi Party starts enacting these laws, and they're targeting Jewish people specifically. It wasn't this gradual thing. It was like, boom.
Yeah, it's like someone flipped a switch.
Yeah.
And that's where this whole concept of Gleichschaltung comes in.
Gleichschaltung.
Yeah, it literally means coordination, but in practice, it meant the Nazis were taking over every aspect of German life.
Whoa.
Schools, newspapers, businesses, everything. They wanted to spread their ideology everywhere.
So, total control.
Total control.
And they move so fast. One of the very first laws they passed was the law for the restoration of the professional civil service.
Right. I mean, it sounds kind of harmless, right? Just moving some things around.
It does, doesn't it? But it was anything but harmless. That law was specifically designed to get rid of Jewish people who had government jobs.
Really?
The chapter actually goes into the details of the legal mechanisms they used, and it's shocking how they hid their true intentions behind all this official language.
So it sounded legit, but it wasn't at all.
Exactly. A wolf in sheep's clothing.
Wow. And this was just the start, right? Oh, absolutely. Just the tip of the iceberg. Then, a few days later, they launch a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses.
Can you imagine that? You're walking down the street and see shops owned by, your friends, your neighbors, suddenly marked, vandalized, all because they're Jewish.
It was about public humiliation. It was a very clear message. Jewish people are not welcome.
And it wasn't just random people doing this.
No, this was all fueled by a very deliberate propaganda machine led by, you guessed it, Joseph Goebbels.
Right, Goebbels. He was a master at manipulating people. He used everything. Newspapers, the radio, posters, to spread these awful stereotypes about Jewish people, making them look like enemies of the state.
Exactly. And he was incredibly effective. He really dehumanized Jewish people in the eyes of many Germans. It's scary how quickly propaganda can poison a society. People start to believe even the most outrageous lies.
And this all paved the way for even worse policies. I can't believe that just 2 years later, in 1935, they came out with the Nuremberg Laws.
The Nuremberg Laws were a major turning point. These laws actually took away German citizenship from Jewish people.
Wow.
They lost their basic rights. They were no longer considered equal members of society. Reading about it, knowing what would happen next, it's just heartbreaking.
It's hard to understand how a whole country could just legally erase the rights of an entire group of people.
I know. And it all came down to this twisted idea of blood purity, which the Nazis were totally obsessed with.
Right. They had this whole theory about racial purity, which they used to justify their actions.
And it wasn't just random discrimination. They actually categorized and segregated people based on this totally made-up idea of race.
It's crazy how they twisted science to fit their agenda. But these laws weren't just abstract ideas. They had a real impact on the daily lives of Jewish people.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine being suddenly barred from your job, your school, even your favorite park.
Yeah.
These laws affected every part of life.
Oh.
Everything from education and jobs to social interactions and even just moving around freely.
In 1933, they passed the law against overcrowding in schools and universities. So Jewish students were suddenly shut out of education.
Their futures were just ripped away. It's devastating to think about.
And then, to make matters worse, in 1941, they forced Jewish people to wear the yellow Star of David.
Right, making them instant targets.
But they were always marked. It's like they wanted Jewish people to live in constant fear, knowing that they were being watched, judged, and treated as less than human.
It was a deliberate strategy to isolate and dehumanize them even further.
Yeah.
Think about the constant anxiety. The feeling that you could be attacked or arrested at any moment for no reason.
That's terrifying.
And sadly, this fear became a horrific reality during Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Even the name, it's chilling.
Yeah.
On November 9th, 1938, this wave of violence just exploded across Germany. Jewish businesses, they were destroyed, synagogues were burned, homes ransacked. It was awful.
The chapter, it really brings that night to life, and it wasn't random. It was organized, it was state-sanctioned terror. Jewish people, any sense of safety they had left was just shattered.
It's hard to even imagine the terror that people must have felt that night. The breaking glass, the flames, the fear for their lives and for their families. It's just awful.
How could something like this even happen? In a country like Germany, how could people just stand by and watch or even join in?
Well, that's where the years of propaganda and dehumanization come in. Goebbels and his campaign, it had poisoned so many people's minds. They actually saw Jewish people as the enemy.
Like a threat.
Yeah, a threat to their way of life.
It's scary, really. Hate speech, misinformation, it creates the conditions for this kind of violence.
It lays the groundwork. It builds and builds until an explosion like this seems, almost inevitable.
And Kristallnacht, it wasn't just a horrific event, it was a turning point. The world saw the brutality of the Nazis, and it foreshadowed the horrors that were still to come.
Yeah, absolutely.
Reading about Kristallnacht, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all the darkness and despair. But then the chapter introduces the story. It offers a bit of hope, a bit of humanity.
Anne Frank in her diary.
Yeah.
Anne Frank's diary. It's just such a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Imagine this young girl in hiding, facing incredible fear and uncertainty, but she finds comfort and strength in writing.
It's amazing she got that diary as a birthday present, June 12th, 1942.
Wow.
Just weeks before her family went into hiding.
It reminds you, even in the darkest times, there are still moments of joy, connection, hope. It's still there.
And her diary gives us this really unique, intimate perspective on what life was like.
Yeah.
It's not just the historical events, it's the emotional impact. You can feel her fear, you can feel her hope, her longing for a normal life.
It's all right there in her words.
She wrote, "I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart."
It's so powerful.
It's really moving.
And her story, it's a reminder that behind all the statistics, all the historical accounts, there were real people. Families, dreams, lives shattered by the Nazi regime.
And her story shows us that even when faced with this unimaginable evil, the human spirit can endure.
Yeah.
You can still find moments of beauty and hope. And it's a testament to the power of words. They can transcend time,
Absolutely.
They connect us to the past in such a personal way.
It's amazing. And what's also striking about Anne Frank's story is that it highlights how these seemingly ordinary laws were used to create such incredible injustice.
You're right. It's easy to think about laws as just these abstract concepts, but when you see how they were actually used to systematically take away the rights of Jewish people, it becomes terrifyingly real.
Exactly. And it's a warning for us today. We need to be vigilant. We need to understand how language can be manipulated, how policies that sound harmless can have devastating consequences.
It's like the chapter is saying, don't just learn the history, learn from it. We need to recognize the warning signs and challenge discrimination wherever we see it. We need to use our voices, speak up for what's right.
It's interesting to think about how this all connects to the world today. We're seeing more and more hate speech, more intolerance, more attempts to divide people based on their differences.
It's like history is repeating itself.
Yeah, well, maybe not exactly repeating, but rhyming, for sure.
We see echoes of that Nazi propaganda machine and how misinformation and disinformation are spreading online.
Right, and it shows that we can't be complacent. We have to think critically, question what we see and hear, and stand up for what's right, even when it's hard.
Because as we've seen, silence in the face of injustice, well, it can have devastating consequences. We have a responsibility to learn from the past, to work towards a future where these horrors never happen again.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in, but it feels like this deep dive has been a real wake-up call for me. It's so easy to think about history as just, the past, something that happened a long time ago. But I don't know.
Still resonates today.
Yeah, the echoes of what happened in Nazi Germany, they're still around.
Absolutely. And that's why this chapter is so important. It's not just about memorizing the dates and the names. It's about understanding how this happened, how a whole society could let this happen.
Right. So if we're trying to hear those echoes today, what should we be listening for? What are the warning signs?
Well, one thing that really stands out in this chapter is how those seemingly ordinary laws were used to discriminate against Jewish people.
It started subtly. The laws, they sounded bureaucratic, harmless even. But gradually they were twisted. They were used to exclude, isolate, and eventually dehumanize an entire group of people.
It's funny you say that because we tend to think of dictatorships as these brutal regimes, right? Just using force to get what they want. But this chapter shows it's often much more insidious.
Right. It's not always so overt.
They use the law, they use propaganda, they manipulate language.
Exactly. It's about control, but in a more subtle way. That's why it's so important to be critical thinkers, to question what we hear and not just accept things at face value. We need to understand how language can be used to hide discriminatory intent, to make the unacceptable seem normal, to make it seem okay.
It's a scary thought, but I feel like we're seeing some of those tactics today. Maybe not on the same scale.
Yeah.
But the seeds are there. The way certain groups are being demonized, the way facts are being twisted, the way language is used to create fear and hatred.
You're right to be concerned. We have to be vigilant. We have to speak out against injustice whenever we see it. We can't let history repeat itself. We can't let hatred and discrimination take root.
Okay, but what can we actually do? As individuals, It feels so overwhelming sometimes. Like one person can't really change anything.
Well, I think the first step is education. We have to learn from the past, understand how these atrocities happened so that we can recognize the warning signs and hopefully prevent them from happening again.
Yeah, this deep dive has definitely been an education for me. It's made me realize how important it is to not just know about history, but to really understand it, to think about why things happened the way they did.
Exactly. And then beyond education, we need to be active in our communities. We need to challenge discrimination and prejudice whenever we see it. Stand up for the rights of all people, regardless of their background or beliefs.
It sounds simple, but it takes courage. It takes a willingness to, speak up, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's risky.
It's not always easy, but it is necessary. Because as we've seen from this chapter, silence in the face of injustice, well, it's complicity. We all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world.
That's a powerful message to end on. It's a call to action. We need to be more than just observers of history. We have a responsibility to learn from the past and use that knowledge to build a better future.
Well said. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you something to think about, something to talk about, and most importantly, something to do. Even small acts of kindness and courage can make a difference. Let's all work together to build a world where the horrors of the past are never repeated.